But to get to the beginning of it, I need to go back to the year 1380, to a little village in North England known as Lutterworth, and to a minister in a church there named John Wycliffe. The story of how we got our English Bible begins with this man, John Wycliffe. He was a man of great faith, and his influence is felt to this day. He became the pastor of this church here in the Midlands of England, and he brought with him a number of students that came from Oxford, and he trained them to become his preacher boys to go out into the marketplaces and into the fields and to preach for him. It wasn't a simple task that they were asked to do. In fact, to be honest about it, it was days of persecution, and every one of those young men that went out to preach for him were eventually going out to die, being burned to death at the stake. But they were committed to that task, and I don't know how many of them there were that did die. I only know that there were hundreds of them eventually that under Wycliffe's doctrine were burned at stakes in various parts of the country and even overseas. He provided for them, in order that they might be equipped for this task, a translation of the Bible into English. The parish had its own parsonage that apparently was situated over in the southwest corner of this facility. I say that because of the pictures that were drawn of him sending out as Lollard preachers from the parish parsonage. It was in the same house that he did the translating work. I think a tribute needs to be paid to this great man for what he did. Every single one of those Bibles had to be handwritten. It was before the days of printing presses. It took 10 months to be able to produce one copy, and when it was produced, the cost for purchasing it was £40. Now remember, there's 240 pennies in a pound, and £40 would be 9,600 pennies, and that in a day when 2 pennies could buy a chicken and 4 pennies could buy a hog. There were men that went to work in the fields and worked for an entire month and brought the entire earnings of that month just so that they could possess one single page of John Wycliffe's Bible. And I don't know how many he produced. I can only imagine that if we stood over in that corner in his day, it was a beehive of activity. I know that for this reason. Every time a copy of his book was found, it was publicly burned. Every time one of his preacher was condemned, he was burned at the stake with the copy that he was using around his neck. They were not only burned in all the different parts of England, they were even burned over in Prague. They were burned over in Switzerland. And yet, there's 170 copies surviving today. 170 copies. After all those were burned, you can only imagine how many that little parsonage produced. And you can visualize how many people it took to accomplish that task. We're standing here now, over 600 years later. But you can walk into that church and see a fragment of the pulpit from which he preached. It happens to be that the night that he collapsed under a stroke, they took him out through a side door, brought him over to his parsonage, and he never spoke again until he spoke to the Savior in the presence of angels. It was only 2 days after that he went to be with the Lord. In the early days of Christianity, they believed that if a person was guilty of a religious crime, that he ought to be punished the way God punishes people, and that is by burning them through fire. It was intended before the death of John Wycliffe that he would be burned. They tried on 3 different occasions to have him tried and found guilty, but failed on every try. It wasn't until 33 years after his death that a pope issued an order that his bones had to be dug out of their grave, burned to ashes, and the ashes had to be distributed in a river. And they didn't even get the courage to do it for another 11 years, because it was 44 years after his death that they dug his bones up from the churchyard where they buried them. They burned them into ashes, and they took the ashes down and they threw them into the river Swift. In their superstitious and pagan thinking, they thought that would spoil his chances of a resurrection. They intended to close the door on his influence in England, but they didn't accomplish that. In fact, when you stop and think about it symbolically, when he threw the ashes into the river Swift, this river flows into the river Avon. The Avon flows into the Severn. The Severn flows into the Bristol Channel. The Bristol Channel empties out into the oceans of the world, and eventually the influence of John Wycliffe touched the shores of New England. They let his influence out. I'm standing in front of Lambeth Palace, which is the London residence of the Archbishop of Canterbury. It's in a very busy section of London today. But the busyness about it in the 1400s would be Lollard preachers. That part of the building behind me is referred to as the Lollards Tower, because it was a place that was used as a prison to keep them until they went out to die. I'm fascinated by these Lollards. I don't know where the name came from, except we know that it was given in derision. If it was taken, for example, from the Old English, it means a vagabond or a wanderer, an idler. Or if it was taken from the Latin, it means a tare, meaning a weed among the wheat. No matter how you look at them, they were not appreciated in their day. But they were magnificent people. They fell under the influence of John Wycliffe, and John Wycliffe gave them something that they would never get at a modern Bible school or seminary. I say that for this reason. He taught them how to live. When they left him and went out to preach, they had no shoes on their feet. They were barefooted. They had coarse clothing. They were specifically told that they were not allowed to beg. If their needs were not provided for, then they were to go and work for it. And a very strong and keen ethic became a part of their living standard. He also taught them how to preach. You see, in that day, these were the people that would refute what the priests were teaching. And they had no better teacher than John Wycliffe. John Wycliffe was the greatest theological brain of his generation. And I don't think that matter could be disputed. And when people in those days went from university to university, they went because they were attracted by the teachers. And the influence of that man's theological thought must have thoroughly trained them, because they were the people that stopped the lies that were being told by the priesthood of that day. The third thing that he taught them how to reproduce. I mean by that, these men were going to give their lives for their faith. It wouldn't take long to stamp out the movement unless they learned how to reproduce themselves. And apparently they well learned the lesson. In those days, there were about 30 to 40 universities across Europe, and students would travel from one to the other attracted by the teachers, and they would fall under the spell of those teachers. In this instance, that would bring truth and allow it to travel to other parts of the world. And it did travel to other parts of the world. In the city of Prague, there was a great riot because of the influence of Wycliffe 50 to 70 years after he was dead. It said in England that 10 years after he was dead, if you met two men on the street, one of them was a Lollard. It was 145 years later that the Bishop of London was writing to Erasmus and explained to him that the New Testament of William Tyndale is adding great fuel to the fires of the Lollards, meaning that they existed 145 years after the death of their founder. There is no question. He thoroughly trained them how to reproduce themselves. And finally, he trained them how to die. It's an uncommon kind of education when you bring a man into a classroom and then tell him that the end result of his study may bring him to a place of death, but that's exactly what happened to these people. There were so many of them that died in different parts of England that over in Norwich, for example, they called the place of public execution the Lollards Pit. And if they died in London, they usually died in a place only a few miles from here called Smithfield. In those days, this was all wide open fields, with the exception of St. Bartholomew's Hospital, that is the oldest hospital of London, and over on the side of it a chapel that dates back to 1123, where incidentally Benjamin Franklin used to do his printing when he came here. But in that day of the Reformation, they had a St. Bartholomew's Day festival that lasted for about a week. People came from all over England and they pitched in tents all over the area. It was a day of celebration. It was a festive spirit. And a part of the entertainment of that day were the men and women that came who loved God so dearly that they were willing to give their lives for their faith right here. When I speak about dying, I'm not talking about something that comes out of a textbook or a history book. I'm talking about the crisis of life where the spirit is separated from the body. And the means by which it happens is by burning their flesh until they die. Think of the cruelty of that. It only prolongs and deepens the agony when a wind blows. Because when it blows in one direction, it carries the flame to one part of the body. On one occasion, a man was put to death here, and he could take his right arm, cross his chest, get a hold of his left arm, pull it from the socket and drop it onto the ground. There were men like John Wycliffe who died here. He was referred to as being the brain of the Reformation period. And what about men like John Lambert? John Lambert, when people came around to see the testimony of this man dying, he couldn't communicate with them any longer, but his last communication, the flames had come up over his head, and he lifted his hands above his head. There were fire shooting out from all 10 fingers, and he cried to the crowd around here, "None but Christ, none but Christ."